Hello, everyone. I'm here today with a book sort of related to some stuff I've been reading and discussing lately. To be a bit more specific about that, I've recently been reading a book called Iron Curtain by Anne Applebaum, which I'm finding really quite excellent and which I plan to review eventually as well, and which goes along with the Soviet and Cold War history theme that's dominated much of my history reading over the past year. But in parallel, I picked up another shorter Cold War era book, one that focuses on a particular nation in Eastern Europe and how its people experienced the so-called Iron Curtain, rather than focusing on the Cold War in some more global sense. This is a book on Hungarian history, namely the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, in which the Hungarian citizens of Budapest revolted against the Soviet communist-controlled secret police, and for a brief period looked like they had succeeded, only to fall back under Soviet control as the Russians continually brought in bigger and better military units to squelch the remaining resistance. This book is called The Bridge at Andau. It's written by award-winning author James Michener, and it describes on an experiential level, in a journalistic style, what happened before, during, and after the Hungarian Revolution. The titular bridge is both actual and metaphorical, referring to the Hungarians' last hope to escape the oppression of the Soviets, whether through revolution or, as it were, fleeing the country by an actual bridge on the border between Hungary and its neighbor to the west, Austria, both of which were efforts of desperate resistance but were ultimately destroyed by the Soviets. If you'd like to learn more about the Hungarian Revolution or the general historical context in which it occurred, I've linked below two brief background videos that I found interesting and helpful, although this info wouldn't really be necessary to understand the review or the book itself. The events in this book took place about 10 years into the Cold War, which was basically an extended period after World War II, in which the United States and their Western allies fought ideologically and sometimes also physically via proxy wars against their former World War II allies, the Soviet Union, and eventually also against several satellite nations over which the communist Soviet Union had extended its influence via military occupation and secret police forces. Hungary was one of these Soviet-occupied nations, and as we see in this book, as well as in Applebaum's Iron Curtain, there was a lot of homegrown resistance at first to the Soviet takeover of the nation, which was, despite Soviet rhetoric, not really achieved democratically or with the Hungarians' interest in mind, at least their short-term interests, and arguably their longer-term interests. It eventually led to the resistance we see in this book, which was led even by self-identified communist intellectuals in Hungary who objected to the Russian prioritizing methods of Soviet communism. For important context, this book was published in 1957, placing it just 1 year after the events it describes. So while some of the horrors described within might seem obvious or unsurprising to readers nowadays in retrospect, at the time Michener was truly alarmed when writing not only by the impact of communism on people living in Eastern Europe or under the Iron Curtain, but also by communism's growing popularity elsewhere, such as in France, India, or Indonesia, at least as he describes it. As a result of this and of his personal experiences living on the Austria-Hungary border, speaking with refugees, this book is quite unapologetically anti-communist, as Michener saw it as his duty not only to honor the tragedy of the Hungarian people, whom he's clearly come to admire, but also to warn the rest of the world about the practical reality of Soviet communism. And if that sounds to you like this book would be pretty polarizing, or that it would read like Cold War propaganda, well, you're absolutely right to be suspicious, and I'm going to explore that a little bit further at the end of the review. My short answer, though, is even if Michener is perhaps sometimes a bit too quick to equate communism in general with Stalin's and later Khrushchev's Russian-centered version of it, and even if his Western biases make him prone to view the United States as exceptional and basically as the peacekeepers of the world, the fact remains that the stories of the Hungarians themselves are credible, captivating, and highly moving, and they are, after all, what this book is really about, most importantly. This isn't a book characterized by beautiful language or highly academic analysis. Instead, it is matter-of-fact and written in quite simple language that I think would appeal to a broader audience than those usually reading history books. For this reason, I'd rank it on the easiest level to understand, the most accessible of history books. Although understanding the historical context might enhance your experience and help you to process it more critically, Michener pretty much tells you everything you need to know for it to be a coherent story. On the other hand, there are atrocities described in this book that will not be so easy to read. For one, there are scenes of violent revolution which, though I appreciated the level of detail the author went into, often involved unspeakable cruelty, including with kids and teenagers as victims and involved in the fighting. Beyond that, there are some accounts of torture that, though fully necessary in this book, involve things that you probably aren't going to want to think about for very long because they just feel spiritually suffocating. But the parts that really got me the most weren't even so much the ones about how the occupiers operated in the prisons and on the battlefield. They were rather the descriptions of how the atmosphere established in Hungary was one of such desperate mistrust and, well, I was going to say hopelessness, although I think the author shows that it wasn't quite that, to the Hungarians' extreme credit. We hear from a university student who was forced to basically be an informer for the secret police because they'd kill his family if he didn't. And then, in case he wasn't doing a good enough job, they told him they had another spy in his class watching him. Were they telling the truth? Should he risk reporting his classmate getting him in trouble for making a vaguely anti-communist statement? Could he risk not reporting his classmate, since that classmate could be the very spy testing his loyalties to the party? Such impossible dilemmas were inescapable for Hungarians at the time, and accounts of them are peppered throughout this book. We really get a sense of how oppressive, how dangerous it feels to be living in a society where you could never speak openly, even with your neighbor or your friend, for fear they could be an informal sort of spy, a Soviet informer. While other stuff I've read about this period, like Anne Applebaum's Iron Curtain, gives you a more global and academic picture supported by interviews and personal accounts on occasion, in The Bridge at Andau, it is the personal accounts that matter to me more than anything else. And it's often terrifying. In so many ways, it feels like reading 1984 by George Orwell, but the real-life version, which makes sense since Orwell was inspired by Soviet communism under Stalin when he wrote that book, I believe in the year 1948. But in this way, Michener makes me feel what it would have been like to be there on a level that goes beyond most other things I've read about this time period. Still, the Hungarians did resist, both in subtle ways and eventually in all-out revolution, despite being up against this oppressive force that was frankly just so much more powerful than them. We learn of a family that taught their kids traditional Hungarian history and corrected the communist brainwashing that they'd learned in schools through secretive meetings in the basement that they never spoke a word of, even to their closest friends. And even this was a huge risk. It was difficult for parents to figure out at what age their child was mature enough to handle this information and to understand that when their teacher asks them at school the very next day, "Who are your favorite people in the world?" they must answer Mom, Dad, and Father Stalin without speaking a word of their parents' disloyalty. But they took this risk because what else did they have to do when compliance barely got you any further than resistance? It's the same sort of spirit of struggling through a futile situation that, during the actual fighting, led teenagers, both boys and girls, to sprint up to tanks head-on, which was fascinatingly the one blind spot that the tank's guns couldn't reach, and they would shove homemade gasoline bombs into the tank's most vulnerable pockets. I'm not sure whether it's inspiring or just plain horrifying, but these were acts of sheer desperation. Although the everyday Hungarian characters are the part of this book that stands out to me most, the characters we see are composites of multiple people, not merely to make them seem more entertaining or exciting, but also because it's important to protect these people's identities. Remember, this was published just a year after the revolution, and even Hungarians who'd escaped and were living abroad had good reasons to fear retribution for talking about their experiences. I didn't find this bothered me because it wasn't like we had these superhuman characters who felt like they were 3 or 4 lives mixed together. And I wouldn't have really even suspected that these were composites unless you told me, which the author does tell us, and without knowing exactly what was done to create them, I don't feel like they're misrepresenting the experiences. Still, at times this could make it difficult to separate the general from the specific, or to see from where these sources were obtained. And although perhaps understandable, the sources covered are pretty one-sided in perspective. We hear from the members of the Hungarian resistance and how they became involved, and often a bunch about their formative life experiences leading up to this point. We don't get the same attention to many Russians or any Hungarian communists who stayed loyal to Russia. The exception to this is that in one chapter we have an in-depth portrait painted for us of a typical AVO man. The AVO, as they're called in this book, were the secret police force of the Hungarian Communist Party, who effectively were the most powerful force in Hungary at the time because they weren't subject to ordinary legal processes. So they could lock you up and torture you simply because they were jealous of the American-made suit you were wearing, which is one of the stories that happens in this book. If you want to know more about the broader context, you should start from the Wikipedia page on the State Protection Authority of Hungary. Although in this book they're called the AVO, their name changed several times, and I think they must have officially actually been the AVH by the time of the Hungarian Revolution. Anyway, in one chapter, the author gives us the profile of a typical AVO man, who we learn at the end of the book, kind of annoyingly, unlike the other characters in this novel, is more of a downright fictionalization based on the authors and others' conceptions of an AVO man, rather than a composite character formed by actual interviews with AVO men. And I really have to say, the author's failure to speak with any actual AVO man or anyone on the Russian side of the conflict is a major shortcoming of this book and contributes to a sense of one-sidedness, even if it would have been admittedly difficult to score such an interview at the time. Michener's portrayal of the AVO man often tends to conflict with itself. At times he is quite clearly a man to be pitied, bullied as a child, rejected by women, one whose only real dream in life is to be able to drive a car and instead has found himself in a job of patrolling the border to shoot any refugees attempting to escape the country. At other times, he comes across as the image of evil itself, a sadistic man who has no empathy for other human beings and who relishes the unbridled power that his job affords him. As a side note, the author also implies that the typical AVO man is often a homosexual, which is a loaded implication that obviously has not aged well, but luckily does not form a significant point of the book other than a casual mention. While I suspect there is some truth in both the humanizing and the more demonizing portrayals, I didn't find them particularly illuminating, and even the more humanizing accounts were not particularly helping me to get in an AVO man's head, especially since it's pretty safe to conclude that many people who became AVO men were probably corralled into the job without really wanting to be there in the first place, and perhaps many of their barbarous actions, even if not really justifiable, were motivated not exclusively by sadism, but also just by fear of punishment for noncompliance, which would have been inevitable. Even being within the ranks of the AVO, we learned from the author that you couldn't just sit comfortably. You had to be paranoid about the other AVO members spying on you for any signs of disloyalty, like sticking up for a prisoner who you think had suffered enough beating for one day. What does come across, though, is that the AVO men didn't necessarily know how what they were doing fit within the larger system. When they were told that their job was to extract information from enemies of the state, they probably actually believed that their victims had committed serious crimes, as opposed to maybe simply being accused by a fearful neighbor of being a fascist or a Nazi or a reactionary or a Jew or whatever the unpopular group of the day was. All this is to say that the AVO chapter has its valuable aspects, but is less illuminating and almost certainly more prejudiced or speculative than the other chapters in this book. So, as with anything written about history, and particularly about Cold War history, and particularly right during the Cold War, it's important to consider where this author is coming from ideologically, what his purpose is in writing the book, and what we know now that he didn't know at the time, and how this all affects how we should read it through a modern lens. For me, this book served two equally important purposes: to document a historical event on a very personal level, and to appeal to the rest of the world, whether to countries considering the experiment of communism, or to people in Western democracies who, he believes, still aren't fully aware of the plight of the Hungarian people and the suffering of others in Eastern Europe who are now living effectively under Soviet control. This latter point is a lot broader in scope, and I'd argue less successfully achieved. There are, of course, some who home in on this one aspect of the book and use it to dismiss the entire book as mere Cold War propaganda, and others who laud it as a brilliant indictment of everything wrong with communism, socialism, and beyond. To me, these are uncritical arguments that not only fail to learn from this writing as a reflection of its historical context and the biases of the time, they also take the weakest point of the book and judge the entire work by it. But since Michener decided to take on this argument, I do still have to break it down here. Although Michener gets across the severity of the situation in Hungary, including the vast numbers of refugees who have fled the country to Austria, hundreds of thousands, his arguments against communism in a broader geopolitical sense are obfuscated by his often sweeping generalizations against communism, which, even if accurate, are not well justified from the limited level of serious argument he spends on them in this book. In condemning the imperialist arm of Soviet communism as it existed, he was very right, because this was an extremely harmful system for many people, and the book provides ample evidence of that. However, his extension of the same criticism to any forms of communism, whether you agree with this final conclusion or not, is not amply justified in the book, nor should it be, because that's not what this book is about. And further, when he tries to extend his conclusions to make recommendations about the West's best actions in the global playing field, he not only fails to provide us readers with sufficient rationale, though again, this whole realm isn't really even within the scope of his book. He also describes things in a way that will make modern readers wonder whether he himself really grasped the intricacies of the geopolitical system, especially how views of the United States from abroad differed from Americans' views of their own country, Soviet propaganda aside. I don't even want to get into this any further here, though, because I simply don't know enough about it, and this book would have been better if the author was a bit less zealous in portraying his hardline stance against communism. This was, nevertheless, an excellent book. I never once found myself bored in the 10-ish hours it took on an audiobook, And as soon as I started listening to it, I knew I'd chosen a good one to read. It's honestly one of my favorite things I've read this year, in spite of the author's shortcomings in his geopolitical awareness. I realize this topic may be a bit esoteric for many and maybe a bit too grim for others, but if you're looking for a highly readable historical narrative, particularly one on life and resistance in the Cold War Soviet bloc, I highly recommend you check out Michener's The Bridge at Andau. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're interested in hearing more reviews on history books and others, including an upcoming one on Anne Applebaum's Iron Curtain. Actually, I may also check out a book specifically about Poland during this time period too. I have a few ideas that looked interesting, so we'll see. And until next time, bye, and happy reading.